Welcome. You have made it to this quiet space at the end of your day. As you settle in, let your breathing slow. Let the concerns of the present fall away, little by little. Tonight, we are going to follow a figure who has nearly vanished from memory. A solitary man in a frozen field far from any village hearth. A medieval shepherd awake through the winter night, surrounded by hundreds of sheep wrapped in heavy wool, lying across a low stone doorway beneath the stars. For centuries these men stayed outside through the coldest months of the year. They had no heated buildings, no modern textiles, no electric light. Yet they survived, night after night, using knowledge passed down through generations. Their methods were practical, tested, quiet. There was no drama in what they did, only careful attention to wind, wool, stone, and the warmth of living bodies pressed close together in the dark. Over the next while, we will move through one winter night with this shepherd. We will see how he prepared his shelter, how he used his clothing, how he positioned himself and his animals to survive until dawn. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The shepherd was not in the winter field by accident. His presence there, alone in the cold, was the result of deliberate economic calculation made by landowners across medieval Europe. Sheep represented one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the agrarian world. A single flock could number in the hundreds or thousands. The wool they produced drove international trade networks that connected English monasteries to Flemish weavers, Castilian ranchers to Italian bankers. This was not subsistence farming. It was capital management on a scale that demanded professional oversight. Monasteries, bishops, noble estates and royal households maintained vast flocks as revenue-generating assets. The medieval wool trade was lucrative enough to finance cathedrals, fund wars, and establish the fortunes of merchant families. Protecting this investment required constant human attention. The shepherd was that attention, embodied. He was typically a younger son with no land inheritance, a wage earner. His role was specialized. He managed the health of the animals, defended them from predators and thieves, and guided their movements across the landscape according to seasonal grazing patterns. In many regions, large-scale transhumance systems organized these migrations. The Mester in Castile, for example, coordinated the annual movement of millions of sheep between summer pastures in the northern mountains and winter grazing grounds in the southern plains. This was mobile wealth. It required mobile guardianship. The choice to employ a human shepherd, rather than rely on fixed infrastructure alone, was pragmatic. Some manorial states did invest in permanent sheepcotes, roofed shelters where flocks could be housed during the worst weather. These structures offered warmth and protection, but they were expensive to build and maintain. They were also geographically fixed, which created a problem for flocks that needed to move across large territories to access fresh pasture. The shepherd solved this problem. He could go wherever the flock needed to be. His body, his skills, and his endurance became the flexible, low-cost alternative to expensive buildings scattered across the landscape. From the landowner's perspective, deploying a trained man to live with the animals was more efficient than constructing and staffing multiple shelters along migration routes. The shepherd's solitary vigil was, therefore, a strategic deployment. His isolation was intentional. His exposure to the elements was factored into the system. He was human infrastructure, positioned at the intersection of biological capital and environmental risk. This calculation extended through the winter months, when the cold became severe and the nights grew long. While other livestock, cattle, horses, oxen, were brought indoors by late November, sheep remained in the fields, not because they were hardier, though their wool did provide natural insulation. They stayed outside because their presence served a secondary economic function that made the shepherd's winter watch indispensable. The fields needed them there. Medieval agriculture in northern Europe, particularly in England, relied on the open field system. After the autumn harvest, the stubble remained in the fields. Sheep were permitted to graze this stubble, but that was not their primary purpose. Their main contribution came from what they left behind: manure. The fallow fields, which would be planted the following season, required fertilization. Animal dung was the most reliable source of nitrogen and organic matter available. Sheep grazing and resting in the fields through the winter deposited this fertilizer directly where it was needed. But the distribution had to be controlled. Left to wander freely, the flock would concentrate their droppings in random patterns, wasting the resource. Folding solved this. Each night the shepherd guided the flock to a designated enclosure, a temporary pen, often made of woven hurdles or couples or simple stone walls. The location of this fold was determined by the manor's agricultural plan. The flock would be penned on a specific strip of domain land, ensuring that the manure was concentrated exactly where the Lord's fields would be planted in the coming months. This was systematic fertilization. The shepherd was the agent of that system. Manorial records and court rolls document the legal enforcement of folding practices. Tenants who failed to fold their flocks correctly, or who allowed animals to graze on prohibited land, faced fines. The practice was not optional. It was woven into the obligations of tenure and the rhythms of the agricultural year. For the shepherd, this meant that his nightly routine was bound to specific locations. He could not simply choose a sheltered spot and settle there. He had to bring the flock to the designated fold, ensure they remained within its boundaries through the night, and guard them until morning. His body had to be there, positioned between the animals and any threat that might emerge from the darkness. This was the shepherd's winter mandate, to serve as both protector and manager, ensuring that valuable animals remained alive and that their biological output was strategically deployed to maintain the soil's fertility. His exposure to the cold was not incidental, it was structural. The entire system depended on his willingness, or his necessity, to stay outside night after night through the coldest months of the year. So the question was not whether he would be in the field. The question was how he would survive there. The shepherd's winter vigil served a purpose beyond the immediate protection of the flock. His nightly presence in the frozen fields was tied to the deeper logic of medieval agriculture. The land itself demanded it. The system of crop rotation, the rhythm of planting and fallow, the future productivity of the soil, all of this depended on the systematic concentration of animal manure in precise locations. The shepherd was the human mechanism that made this concentration possible. In the open field agriculture practiced across much of northern Europe, arable land was divided into large fields, which were then subdivided into long, narrow strips. Each peasant household held scattered strips throughout these fields. After the autumn harvest, the stubble remained standing. The fields became common grazing ground. But not all animals grazed equally, or for the same duration. Cattle and horses, being heavier and more destructive to wet soil, were typically removed from the fields by late November. They were brought into barns or enclosed yards, where they would remain through the winter. Sheep, however, stayed longer. In many regions, they grazed the stubble well into December, and in milder areas, they might remain until the following spring or even autumn. This extended presence was not primarily about feeding the animals. The stubble provided some nutrition, but by midwinter, its value as forage was minimal. The sheep's true contribution came from their hooves and their droppings. As the flock moved across the field, their hooves trampled the remaining straw into the soil, incorporating organic matter. Their urine and dung deposited nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients directly onto the ground. Over weeks and months, this biological input transformed the fallow field into a reservoir of fertility, ready to support the next season's crop. But this process required management. If the flock wandered freely, the manure would be distributed unevenly. Some areas would receive heavy deposits, others would receive none. The result would be patchy fertility, with corresponding variation in crop yields. Medieval agriculture could not afford such waste. The goal was uniform, controlled enrichment of the soil. Folding was the method. Each evening, as the light faded, the shepherd gathered the flock and guided them to a temporary enclosure. This fold was constructed of movable hurdles, wooden frames woven with willow or hazel, or low walls of piled stone. The enclosure was small enough to concentrate the animals, but large enough to prevent overcrowding and distress. The location of the fold was not chosen by the shepherd. It was determined by the manorial estate or, in the case of tenant farmers, by agreement with the lord. The fold would be positioned on a specific strip of domain land, the portion of the field reserved for the lord's direct cultivation. Night after night, the fold would be moved incrementally across the field, ensuring that every strip received an equal distribution of manure. This was precision agriculture, conducted in darkness and cold. The shepherd's role in this system was both labour and liability. He had to know the exact boundaries of the designated strips. He had to move the fold at the correct intervals. He had to ensure the flock entered the enclosure and remained there through the night. If the animals escaped, or if the fold was placed incorrectly, the fertilization plan would fail, the soil would suffer, the following year's harvest would be reduced. Manorial courts enforced this responsibility with financial penalties. Records from English estates show fines levied against shepherds or tenants who failed to fold their flocks properly, who overstocked common pastures, or who allowed animals to graze on prohibited ground. The practice was legally binding. It was part of the contractual relationship between tenant and lord and between shepherd and employer. For the shepherd, this meant that his winter nights were not a matter of personal choice. He could not seek out the most sheltered valley or the warmest hillside. He had to position himself wherever the folding schedule required. If the designated strip was on exposed high ground, he slept there. If it was in a low, damp hollow, he slept there. The logic of soil fertility overrode his comfort. This obligation extended through the entirety of winter. In regions with longer growing seasons, the folding might pause during the coldest weeks, but in much of England and northern France, the practice continued without significant interruption. The flock remained in the fields. The shepherd remained with them. The result was a landscape dotted with temporary enclosures, each one occupied by a solitary figure and his animals, night after night, slowly fertilizing the land in a pattern dictated by the needs of next year's wheat, barley or oats. This was not romantic pastoralism, it was agrarian logic in its most uncompromising form. The shepherd's body was deployed as a tool of agricultural management. His endurance was factored into the estate's productivity calculations. His abilities to survive the cold was assumed, or at least it was considered, an acceptable cost relative to the economic benefit of systematic folding. The shepherd, for his part, had little choice in the matter. His wages depended on fulfilling this role. His livelihood was bound to the health of the flock and the satisfaction of his employer. If he refused the work or failed to perform it adequately, he would be replaced. So he stayed. He guided the flock to the fold each evening. He ensured they remained within the boundaries. He guarded them through the night. And in doing so, he became an essential component of the medieval agricultural cycle, a human agent ensuring that the soil received the biological input it required to sustain the community through the coming year. The mandate was clear. The shepherd must remain in the field, exposed to the winter, because the land itself required his presence. The shepherd stood at the edge of the enclosure as the last light faded. Behind him, the village was distant. The nearest hearth, the nearest wall, the nearest source of permanent shelter, all of these were beyond reach. He would not return to them tonight. He would not sleep indoors. His position was here, in the open field, with the flock gathered into the fold and the cold settling over the landscape like a weight. This was the essential problem of the winter watch. A human body designed for warmth and shelter, placed deliberately in an environment that offered neither. No roof, no walls, no fire large enough to sustain comfort through the long hours. Just the exposed field, the wind moving across it, and the night ahead. The temperature would drop steadily. In northern Europe, winter nights could fall well below freezing. The wind, even a moderate breeze, would strip heat from any exposed surface. The ground itself would radiate cold upward, drawing warmth from anything in contact with it. The air would grow dense and still, or it would move in gusts that cut through fabric and found every gap in the shepherd's defences. The human body, left unprotected in such conditions, would begin to lose heat immediately. The core temperature, normally maintained at a narrow range near 37 degrees Celsius, would start to fall. The extremities, fingers, toes, ears, nose, would lose warmth first, as blood flow was redirected inward to protect vital organs. If the cold persisted, and if no countermeasures were taken, the body would enter hypothermia. Thought would slow, coordination would fail, eventually consciousness would fade. This was the trajectory the shepherd had to prevent. He had no option to avoid the night. His responsibility demanded his presence. The flock could not be left unattended. Predators, wolves, bears, and in some regions lynxes, moved through the winter landscape hungry and opportunistic. Thieves, equally desperate, might attempt to steal animals under cover of darkness. The shepherd's vigilance was the only barrier between the flock and these threats, but vigilance required consciousness. Consciousness required warmth, and warmth in the open field required deliberate construction. The shepherd could not rely on the environment to provide comfort. The landscape offered no natural shelter adequate to the task. A stand of trees might block some wind, but it would not retain heat. A hillside might offer a slight windbreak, but the ground would still radiate cold. The earth itself, frozen or near frozen, was an enemy. Contact with it would draw heat from the body faster than almost any other surface. So the shepherd had to build his own microclimate. He had to create a pocket of survivable warmth in a space that was fundamentally hostile to human habitation. This pocket had to be large enough to accommodate his body and, ideally, to allow him to rest in relative comfort. It had to be durable enough to last through the night without constant maintenance. And it had to be constructed quickly, using only the materials immediately available in the field. This was not a one-time challenge. It was a nightly routine repeated through the entire winter season. Each evening, as the flock was folded, the shepherd would assess the site. He would identify the best location for his rest. He would gather the materials he needed. He would construct his defences against the cold, and then, when all was ready, he would settle into position and begin the long watch. The challenge was compounded by the nature of the work itself. The shepherd could not simply build a shelter and retreat into it. He had to remain accessible to the flock. He had to be able to hear any disturbance, any sign of restlessness or alarm. He had to position himself where he could respond immediately if a predator approached or if the animals began to panic. His shelter, therefore, could not be a sealed cocoon. It had to be open enough to allow vigilance, but protective enough to prevent heat loss. This balance between security and exposure, between warmth and awareness, defined the shepherd's nightly existence. He could not afford to be too warm because warmth induced sleep and deep sleep was dangerous. He could not afford to be too cold because cold impaired his ability to react. He had to maintain a state of controlled discomfort, alert enough to respond, comfortable enough to endure. The tools available to him were limited. He had his clothing carefully chosen and layered to trap warmth. He had the materials of the landscape, a stone, earth, turf, perhaps some gathered wood. He had the flock itself, a living source of heat that could be strategically utilised. And he had his own knowledge, accumulated over years of winter nights, refined through trial and error, into a set of practice techniques. These techniques were not written down. They were not formally taught. They were passed from one shepherd to another, learned through observation and experience, adapted to local conditions and individual need. The knowledge was practical, specific, and deeply rooted in the physical realities of cold weather survival. The shepherd's challenge then was to apply this knowledge with precision. He had to assess the wind direction and choose a site that minimised exposure. He had to evaluate the ground and determine whether it was too wet, too frozen, or stable enough to support his weight through the night. He had to calculate how much fuel he could gather, how long it would last, and whether the effort of maintaining a fire was worth the heat it would provide. He had to position the flock in a way that maximised their collective warmth while minimising the risk of disturbance. Every decision mattered. Every small adjustment in position, every additional layer of wool, every stone placed to block the wind, each of these was a component of the survival strategy. There was no single solution. There was only the accumulation of small, careful choices, each one designed to tip the balance slightly in favour of warmth, slightly away from the cold. And so the shepherd began. As the darkness deepened and the temperature fell, he moved through the familiar sequence of preparations. He checked his clothing, he arranged his cloak, he gathered what he needed from the immediate surroundings, he positioned himself at the entrance to the fold, the place where his presence would do the most good. And then he settled in to wait. The night stretched ahead. The cold pressed close. The flock behind him began to quiet. The shepherd, wrapped in wool and sheltered by stone, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, watching the darkness, listening for any sound that should not be there. This was the problem. This was the challenge. And this, night after night, was how he survived. The shepherd's first defence against the cold was the wool he wore. This was not a matter of fashion or preference. It was biological necessity, translated into textile engineering. Wool was the only material available to medieval Europe that could provide reliable insulation in wet, freezing conditions. Linen was absorbent and would chill the wearer when damp. Leather was wind-resistant but lacked the critical property of trapping warm air. Wool, alone among common fabrics, combined water resistance, breathability, and thermal retention in a single fibre. The shepherd understood this, though not in scientific terms. He knew wool worked. He knew it kept him alive. The structure of wool fibre is what makes this possible. Each strand is covered with overlapping scales, like roof tiles. These scales naturally repel liquid water. When rain or snow lands on the surface of woolen cloth, it tends to bead and roll off rather than soaking in immediately. This is why sheep can stand in a downpour and remain relatively dry beneath their fleece. But wool also has a second, seemingly contradictory property. It can absorb moisture from the air, up to 1/3 of its own weight, without feeling wet to the touch. This absorbed moisture is held within the fiber's internal structure, not on its surface. The process of absorption generates a small amount of heat, a phenomenon called the heat absorption. More importantly, the wool does not become cold and clammy the way a soaked linen shirt would. It remains warm, or at least neutral against the skin. This dual nature, repelling liquid water while absorbing vapour, meant that the shepherd could wear wool through a damp winter night without experiencing the dangerous chill of wet fabric clinging to his body. His sweat would be absorbed and managed. Rain or snow would be deflected. The wool would continue to insulate even when the conditions were far from dry. The insulation itself came from air, not from the fibre. Wool does not generate heat. No fabric does. What wool does is trap air in the spaces between its kishibuas, and it is this air, warmed by the body, that provides the insulation. The more air a fabric can hold, the better it insulates. The key is to prevent that air from moving. If warm air escapes and is replaced by cold air, the insulation fails. Wool's natural crimp, the waviness of each fibre, creates a three-dimensional structure that holds air efficiently. The fibres do not lie flat. They tangle and interlock, forming a matrix of small pockets. When woven into cloth, this structure is preserved. When layered, it is multiplied. The shepherd's clothing exploited this principle through layering. His first layer, worn directly against the skin, was a thin woolen undergarment. This base layer absorbed sweat and provided a minimal barrier between skin and the next layer. It was light enough to avoid restricting movement, but substantial enough to begin the process of trapping body-warmed air. Over this, he wore a kotta, a loose, simple tunic made of woolen cloth. The weave of this garment was deliberately open, not tight. A loose weave allowed the fabric to hold more air. The garment itself was cut to fit loosely around the torso, creating an additional layer of still air between the inner garment and the outer one. This middle layer was where the majority of insulation occurred. The more volume it could contain, the more warmth it could retain. The outer layer was denser and more tightly woven. This garment, often a tunic or jerkin, served a different function. Its purpose was not to trap air, but to block wind. Wind is the enemy of insulation. It moves across the surface of fabric, strips away the warm air, and replaces it with cold. A tight weave minimizes this exchange. The outer garment became a windbreak, sealing the warmth generated by the inner layers and preventing it from being carried away. This three-layer system was intuitive, developed over generations without formal understanding of thermodynamics, but it was functionally sound. It maximized warmth while allowing the body to regulate moisture. It provided flexibility so that layers could be adjusted depending on activity level and temperature, and it was constructed entirely from a single material, wool, which meant that every layer contributed to the overall insulation without introducing the weaknesses of mixed fabrics. But the system had to account for the body's own behaviour. The human body does not heat itself evenly. It prioritizes the core, the torso, the organs, the brain. When exposed to cold, the body will sacrifice the extremities to maintain core temperature. Blood flow to the hands, feet, ears, and nose is reduced. Heat is redirected inward. This is an automatic survival response, but it creates a problem. Cold hands cannot work. Numb fingers cannot tie knots or grip a staff. Frozen toes make walking painful and clumsy. The shepherd's strategy, therefore, was to prevent the body from initiating this response. If the core remained warm, the body would continue to supply blood to the extremities. The key was to seal the torso and prevent heat loss from the areas where it mattered most. This meant covering the neck, which is a major point of heat exchange. It meant ensuring the chest and back were well insulated. It meant protecting the head, which, though it does not lose a disproportionate amount of heat compared to other body parts, is nonetheless a significant source of heat loss due to its high surface area and constant exposure. The shepherd wore a hood or a simple woolen cap. This covered the scalp and often wrapped around the neck to seal the gap between the head and the shoulders. The hood also protected the ears, which are particularly vulnerable to frostbite due to their thin tissue and exposed position. Around the neck, he might wrap a length of cloth or ensure that his outer tunic had a high collar. This prevented cold air from flowing down inside his clothing, which would negate the entire insulation system. A single gap at the neck could allow body-warmed air to escape and cold air to rush in, creating convective heat loss that would rapidly chill the torso. The wrists were similarly important. The sleeves of his outer garment were often long enough to cover the backs of the hands, or he wore simple woolen mittens. Mittens, not gloves. Mittens allowed the fingers to share warmth, reducing heat loss. Gloves, which separate each finger, expose more surface area and make it harder for the hands to maintain temperature. The legs and feet received less insulation, not because they were unimportant, but because the materials available were limited and had to be allocated where they would do the most good. The shepherd might wear woolen hose or leg wrappings, and simple leather boots stuffed with straw or moss for additional insulation. But his focus was always on the core. If the torso stayed warm, the blood would flow. If the blood flowed, the extremities would remain functional. This understanding that warmth is a matter of circulation as much as insulation shaped every decision about clothing. The shepherd did not try to heat every part of his body equally. He heated the parts that mattered most, and he trusted his body to distribute that heat where it was needed. The result was a system that worked. Night after night, through the coldest months, the wool trapped air, the layers multiplied the effect, the wind was blocked, the core stayed warm, and the shepherd, wrapped in this carefully constructed architecture of fibre and air, could endure the hours until dawn without succumbing to the cold. The shepherd's clothing was not a single garment, but a constructed environment. Each layer had a purpose. Each piece was positioned deliberately. The system began at the skin and extended outward, building insulation in stages, creating a gradient of warmth that extended from the body's heat into the cold air beyond. The innermost layer was light, a thin woolen undergarment, sometimes a simple shirt and braise, worn directly against the skin. This garment absorbed the body's moisture, sweat, the constant vapour released through the skin, and held it within the fibre structure. By wicking this moisture away from the skin and distributing it through the fabric, the inner layer prevented the damp, clammy feeling that would otherwise make the cold seem worse. But this layer did more than manage moisture. It also created the first boundary of still air. Air that is in contact with the skin warms quickly. If that air is allowed to circulate freely, the warmth is lost. The inner garment, even though it was thin, created a slight barrier that slowed the circulation. The fabric held the warm air close to the body, giving it time to accumulate before it was passed to the next layer. The second layer was where insulation truly began. This was the cotta, a loose-fitting tunic made of woolen cloth. Unlike the inner garment, which was relatively smooth and tight-woven, the cotta was constructed from a looser weave. The fibres were not packed tightly together. Instead, they formed a more open structure, with more space between the individual threads. This space was the key. Air filled the gaps in the weave. When the garment was worn, the body's heat warmed this trapped air. The loose fit of the cotta meant that a larger volume of air was enclosed between the inner garment and the outer surface of the tunic. This created a thicker insulating layer, more effective at retaining warmth. The principle was simple. Still air is an excellent insulator. Moving air, by contrast, carries heat away. The cotta's function was to create a pocket of air that remained as still as possible, warmed continuously by the body, protected from disturbance by the fabric around it. The thickness of this layer varied depending on the severity of the cold. In early winter, a single cot might be sufficient. In the deepest cold, the shepherd might wear two, one over the other, doubling the volume of trapped air, and therefore the insulation. The layers did not need to be heavy. They needed to be voluminous. Bulk, not weight, was what mattered. But bulk alone was not enough. The trapped air had to be protected from the wind. Wind destroys insulation. It penetrates fabric, especially loose weaves, and replaces warm air with cold. A strong wind can strip away body heat faster than almost any other environmental factor. The shepherd's inner layers, effective as they were at trapping warmth, would be useless if the wind could reach them. This is where the outer layer came in. The outer garment was constructed from tightly woven wool. The fibres were packed closely together, with minimal space between threads. This dense weave acted as a windbreak. Air moving across the surface of the fabric could not easily pass through it. The wind was deflected, forced to move around the garment rather than through it. This outer layer was often a tunic or jerkin that fit more closely to the body than the cot. It did not need to be loose. Its job was not to trap air, but to seal the air that had already been trapped by the inner layers. It formed the shell of the insulation system, the boundary between the controlled warmth inside and the hostile cold outside. The outer garment also provided a second benefit. It was the first line of defense against precipitation. Rain, sleet and snow, no landing on the tightly woven surface, would bead and roll off rather than soaking through immediately. This was not complete waterproofing. Wool will eventually absorb water if exposed long enough, but it provided enough resistance to keep the inner layers dry during brief exposure to wet conditions. The shepherd's hands required special attention. Fingers lose heat rapidly due to their high surface area relative to their volume. Gloves, which separate each finger into its own compartment, expose more surface area and make it harder to retain warmth. Mittens were the better solution. By allowing the fingers to rest together, mittens reduced the total surface area exposed to the cold and allowed the fingers to share their warmth. Woolen mittens, even simple ones, could keep the hands functional for hours. The shepherd needed his hands for many tasks: adjusting the fold, managing the dog, tending the fire, gripping his staff. Cold hands would make all of these tasks more difficult or impossible. The mittens were not a luxury, they were a functional requirement. The head and neck were equally critical. The head, though it does not lose a disproportionately large amount of heat compared to other parts of the body, is a significant source of heat loss simply because it is almost always exposed. The scalp has a high density of blood vessels close to the surface. When these vessels are exposed to cold air, heat is lost rapidly through convection. A woolen cap or hood covered the scalp and trapped a layer of warm air around the head. The hood, if it was part of the outer garment or a separate piece, could be pulled forward to protect the face from wind. It could also be drawn tight around the neck, sealing the gap where cold air might otherwise enter, and flow down inside the clothing. The neck was one of the most important points to seal. A gap at the neck allows warm air from inside the clothing to escape upward, while cold air is drawn in from below. This creates a convective loop, a continuous flow of air that strips away warmth. Preventing this required careful attention to how the garments fit together. A high collar on the outer tunic, a scarf or cloth wrapped around the neck, or a hood that could be tightened. All of these served to close the gap and maintain the integrity of the insulation system. The wrists were another point of potential heat loss. The sleeves of the outer garment needed to be long enough to cover the wrists completely, or the shepherd would wear separate wrist wrappings, strips of wool wound around the lower forearm and hand. This sealed the opening at the end of the sleeve and prevented cold air from reaching the skin. The lower body received less elaborate insulation, partly because the materials available were limited, and partly because the legs, being more active, generated more heat through movement. The shepherd might wear woolen hose or leg wrappings that covered the calves and thighs. Leather boots, stuffed with straw or dried moss, provided some insulation for the feet, though the feet were often the coldest part of the body by morning. But the shepherd's strategy was not to heat every part of his body equally. It was to heat the core and let the body's circulation distribute warmth to the extremities. By keeping the torso, neck, and head well insulated, he ensured that his core temperature remained high enough that his body would continue to send warm blood to his hands and feet. This was the logic of layered clothing. It was not random. It was not simply a matter of wearing more fabric. It was a carefully constructed system, each layer serving a specific function, each piece positioned to maximize warmth while minimizing bulk and restriction. The shepherd adjusted this system throughout the evening. If he was moving, guiding the flock to the fold, he might loosen his outer garment to allow heat to escape and prevent overheating. If he was settling into position for the night, he would tighten everything, sealing every gap, ensuring that no warmth could leak away. The clothing was, in essence, a portable shelter. It moved with him. It adapted to his needs. It required no construction beyond the initial weaving and sewing, and it provided the first, most essential layer of defense against the winter cold. Without it, the shepherd would not have survived the first hour. The shepherd's body did not distribute warmth evenly. This was not a flaw. It was a survival mechanism shaped by millennia of evolution. When exposed to cold, the human body makes choices. It decides which parts to protect and which parts to sacrifice. The shepherd, through years of winter nights, had learned to work with this hierarchy rather than against it. The core came first. Always. The torso contains the organs essential to life: the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys. These organs must maintain a narrow temperature range to function properly. If the core temperature drops even a few degrees below normal, the body begins to fail. Thought becomes confused, coordination deteriorates. Eventually the organs shut down. The body knows this. When it senses cold, it acts immediately to protect the core. Blood vessels in the skin constrict, reducing blood flow to the surface and minimizing heat loss. Metabolic rate increases, generating more internal heat, and blood flow is redirected away from the extremities toward the vital organs. This redirection is automatic. The shepherd could not prevent it even if he wanted to. His body would always prioritize the survival of the core over the comfort of his fingers and toes. But this created a practical problem. Cold fingers cannot grip. Numb hands cannot work. If the shepherd's hands became too cold, he would lose the ability to manage the flock, adjust his clothing, or tend the fire. His effectiveness as a guardian would be compromised. The solution was not to fight the body's hierarchy, but to satisfy it. If the core remained warm, the body would not initiate the extreme measures of peripheral vasoconstriction. It would continue to send blood to the hands and feet. The extremities would remain functional. The key was to ensure that the torso never felt threatened, that it never sensed a need to shut down circulation to the limbs. This is why the shepherd focused so much attention on his torso. The chest and back were wrapped in multiple layers of wool. The neck was sealed to prevent heat from escaping upward. The abdomen, though less critical than the chest, was still well insulated. Every effort was made to maintain warmth in this central region. The head received similar attention, not because it loses heat disproportionately. Despite popular belief, the head loses roughly the same percentage of heat as any other uncovered body part of equivalent size, but because it is almost always exposed and because the scalp has a rich blood supply close to the surface. Covering the head reduced one major avenue of heat loss and helped maintain the overall sense of warmth that the body used to assess whether core protection was necessary. The shepherd also understood, perhaps intuitively, that maintaining warmth was not just about insulation, it was about circulation. Cold muscles contract, cold blood flows sluggishly. If the body becomes too still, blood pools in the core and does not reach the extremities efficiently. Movement helps, even small movements, flexing the fingers, shifting weight from one foot to the other, rolling the shoulders, all of these promote circulation and help distribute warmth. But movement also generates heat, and in the cold this is valuable. Muscle activity produces metabolic heat as a byproduct. A body at rest generates a baseline amount of heat. A body in motion generates more. The shepherd could not move constantly. His role required stillness and vigilance, but he could incorporate small periodic movements into his watch. He might stand and walk the perimeter of the fold every hour. He might flex his hands inside his mittens, opening and closing his fingers to keep blood flowing. He might shift his position, adjusting how he sat or lay, to prevent pressure points from cutting off circulation. These were small actions, but they made a significant difference over the course of a long night. The body's hierarchy also extended to sensory function. The face, particularly the nose and cheeks, is highly sensitive to cold. This sensitivity serves a purpose. It provides early warning that conditions are becoming dangerous, but it can also be misleading. A cold face does not necessarily mean the body is in danger. It simply means the face is exposed. The shepherd learned to distinguish between discomfort and danger. A cold nose was unpleasant but not life-threatening. Cold feet were a nuisance but manageable. The warning signs that mattered were deeper: shivering that would not stop, confusion, loss of coordination, the urge to lie down and rest in conditions where rest would be fatal. Shivering itself was part of the hierarchy. It was the body's first active defense against cold. When the core temperature begins to drop, the body initiates rapid, involuntary muscle contractions. These contractions generate heat, raising the metabolic rate significantly. Shivering is uncomfortable and exhausting, but it is effective. It can increase heat production by several times the resting rate. The shepherd knew that shivering was a signal. It meant his insulation was insufficient for the current conditions. It meant he needed to take action, add another layer, move closer to the fire, adjust his position to reduce wind exposure. If he ignored the signal and continued to lose heat, The shivering would eventually stop, not because he had warmed up, but because his body no longer had the energy to sustain it. That was the point of real danger. But if he responded appropriately, the shivering would subside, his body would stabilize, the core would remain warm, and the extremities would remain functional. The shepherd's clothing system was designed to support this hierarchy. The heaviest insulation was on the torso. The next priority was the head and neck. The arms received moderate insulation, enough to keep them functional. The legs received less because they were in motion more often and generated their own heat. The feet, though they received some protection, were often the coldest part of the body by morning. This was acceptable. Cold feet were uncomfortable, but they did not prevent the shepherd from performing his duties. As long as the core remained warm, as long as the hands could grip and the mind could think, the shepherd could endure. The body's hierarchy also influenced how the shepherd rested. He did not lie flat on the ground, which would expose the entire length of his body to the cold surface. Instead, he curled slightly, reducing surface contact. He positioned himself so that his torso was elevated or insulated from the ground by his cloak or a layer of straw or heather. He kept his arms close to his body rather than extended, minimizing heat loss. Even his posture while sitting was deliberate. He might sit with his knees drawn up, his arms wrapped around them, creating a compact shape that reduced surface area and conserved heat. This position also allowed him to rest while remaining alert, ready to stand quickly if needed. The shepherd's understanding of his body's priorities was not scientific, but it was accurate. He knew that if he kept his core warm, his body would take care of the rest. He knew that small adjustments in position, small increases in insulation, could make the difference between a tolerable night and a dangerous one. He also knew his limits. There were nights when the cold was too severe, when the wind was too strong, when even the best preparation was not enough. On those nights, the shepherd had to accept discomfort. He had to endure, but he also had to recognize when discomfort was crossing into danger, when his body was no longer capable of maintaining core temperature despite his efforts. On such nights, the shepherd might build a larger fire, accepting the risks of visibility and fuel consumption. He might position himself more directly among the flock, relying more heavily on their warmth. He might, if conditions were extreme enough, abandon the open field entirely and seek better shelter, even if it meant leaving the fold unattended for a short time. But these were exceptions. Most nights the hierarchy held. The core stayed warm, the extremities remained functional. The shepherd endured, not through any single strategy, but through the accumulation of small, careful decisions, each one aligned with the body's fundamental priorities. And when morning came, when the cold began to ease and the light returned, the shepherd would stand, stretch the stiffness from his limbs, and begin another day. The hierarchy had worked. The body had survived. The night was over. The shepherd's most essential tool was not a staff or a knife. It was a single piece of heavy wool that hung from his shoulders, wrapped around his body and draped to his feet. The cloak was everything. Coat, windbreak, blanket, tent. It was the boundary between his body and the hostile night. It was architecture that moved with him, shelter that required no construction, warmth that needed no fire. Without it, the shepherd's survival would have been significantly more difficult, perhaps impossible. The cloak was made of thick wool, sometimes woven from the coarsest fibres of the fleece, sometimes made from goat hair in regions where goats were more common than sheep. The fabric was heavy, substantially heavier than the clothing worn beneath it. This weight was intentional. A light cloak would have been lifted and disturbed by the wind. A heavy cloak hung straight, resisting the air's movement, forming a solid barrier. The length mattered. A short cloak would have exposed the legs and provided little coverage when the shepherd sat or lay down. A full-length cloak, reaching nearly to the ground, could be wrapped entirely around the body. It could cover the legs when sitting. It could be pulled over the head for additional protection. It could be spread on the ground as a layer between the body and the cold earth. The cloak's utility came from its size and its single-piece construction. Unlike the layered garments worn beneath it, the cloak was not fitted. It was essentially a large rectangle of fabric, sometimes with a hood attached, fastened at the neck with a brooch or simple tie. This loose design allowed for multiple configurations. The shepherd could wear it normally, draped over both shoulders. He could shift it to one side, freeing an arm for work. He could wrap it tightly around himself, creating a cocoon. He could spread it flat as a ground sheet or gather it as a pillow. This versatility was essential. The shepherd's needs changed throughout the night. Early in the evening, while he was still moving, preparing the fold, tending the fire, he might wear the cloak loosely or even set it aside temporarily to avoid overheating. As the temperature dropped and he settled into his watching position, he would wrap it more tightly, ensuring that every part of his body was covered. When it was time to rest, the cloak became a bed. The ground was the shepherd's greatest enemy in terms of heat loss. Direct contact with cold earth conducts warmth away from the body faster than almost any other surface. Stone is worse, but even soil, especially frozen or damp soil, will drain heat rapidly. The shepherd needed a barrier between himself and the ground. The cloak provided this. Spread flat, it created a layer of insulation. The thick wool, even when compressed by the weight of the body, retained some loft, some airspace within the fibres. This air provided a buffer. It slowed the transfer of heat from body to ground, but the cloak alone was often not enough. The shepherd would supplement it with whatever materials were available. A layer of straw or dried grass, if he had time to gather it. A bed of heather or bracken cut from the hillside. Even a scattering of loose turf or sod placed beneath the cloak would provide additional insulation. Once this base was prepared, the shepherd would lie on one half of the cloak and fold the other half over himself. The cloak thus served as both mattress and blanket. His body was sandwiched between two layers of heavy wool, insulated from below and covered from above. This arrangement was not perfectly warm. The shepherd would still feel the cold, the ground would still draw heat from him, though more slowly, but the cloak transformed a lethal situation into a survivable one. It provided just enough insulation, just enough protection, to allow the body to maintain core temperature through the night. The cloak also defended against wind. Wind as much as cold was the shepherd's adversary. A still night at 10 degrees below freezing could be more tolerable than a windy night just below freezing. Wind strips away the layer of warm air that surrounds the body and replaces it constantly with cold air. This convective heat loss is rapid and relentless. When the shepherd wrapped the cloak around himself, he created a wind barrier. The heavy wool did not flap or billow. It hung close to the body, sealed at the neck, draping to the ground. Wind moving across the surface of the cloak could not easily penetrate the fabric. The warm air inside, heated by the body, remained relatively undisturbed. The hood, if the cloak had one, provided additional protection. Pulled over the head and drawn forward, it shielded the face from direct wind. It trapped warm air around the head and neck. It reduced the surface area of exposed skin. A hooded cloak could make the difference between a face raw and chapped from wind exposure and a face that remained relatively comfortable. The cloak's dark colour, typically natural wool tones ranging from cream to dark brown or grey, also served a function. Dark colours absorb more heat from any available sunlight. During the late afternoon, as the shepherd prepared for the night, the cloak would absorb the last rays of sun, storing a small amount of warmth in the fabric. This stored heat would be released slowly as the evening progressed. It was not a large amount, but in the calculus of cold weather survival, every small advantage mattered. The cloak required maintenance. Wool, though durable, could be damaged by rough use, by thorns, by careless handling near the fire. A torn cloak was less effective. A burned cloak could be a disaster. The shepherd treated his cloak with care, not out of sentiment but out of necessity. It was irreplaceable in the field. If it was damaged, he would have to repair it himself, using a needle and thread carried for that purpose, or endure the rest of the season with diminished protection. The cloak also absorbed the odours of the shepherd's life. Smoke from countless fires, the lanolin and musk of the sheep, sweat, earth. It became saturated with these scents, a tangible record of months spent in the field. But wool's natural properties meant that it did not retain moisture the way other fabrics would. It dried quickly. It resisted rot. A cloak could be used season after season, becoming softer and more pliable with age, until the fabric finally wore through and had to be replaced. Some shepherds, particularly those in regions with harsh winters, wore cloaks made of multiple layers stitched together. These doubled cloaks were heavier still, but they provided additional insulation and durability. The layers could be separated if the shepherd became too warm or kept together for maximum protection. In the coldest nights, the shepherd might wrap himself in his cloak and then cover himself with additional materials, a second cloak if he had one, sheepskins if available, even the bodies of the sheep themselves if the situation was desperate. and the flock was calm enough to tolerate his proximity. But most nights the cloak alone was sufficient. It was the shepherd's constant companion, his portable shelter, his defence against the elements. It was the single most important piece of equipment he owned. He slept under it, travelled in it, worked while wearing it. It was in a very real sense his world, a world of heavy wool that he carried on his shoulders, that wrapped around him when he needed it, that kept him alive through the long winter nights. The cloak that protected the shepherd did not begin its life as a windproof armour. When the wool was first woven into the cloth, it was relatively loose, permeable, vulnerable to wind and water. The fabric had to be transformed. This transformation required a process that seemed at first glance destructive. The cloth had to be beaten, compressed, deliberately damaged until it became something stronger than it had been. This process was called fulling. Fulling was essential. Without it, woolen cloth would have been inadequate for the shepherd's needs. The fabric would have allowed wind to pass through, would have absorbed water readily, would have provided insufficient insulation. Fulling changed the structure of the cloth at a fundamental level, turning loose weave into dense felt, transforming individual fibres into a unified, resilient material. The process began after the cloth left the loom. Fresh woven wool contained natural oils, primarily lanolin from the sheep's fleece, as well as dirt, plant matter, and other debris accumulated during shearing and spinning. This had to be removed. The cloth was placed in a solution of water mixed with an alkaline substance, typically Fuller's earth, a type of clay that absorbed grease, or in some cases stale urine, which contains ammonia and serves the same purpose. The cloth was soaked in this solution, allowing the alkali to break down the oils and release the dirt. Then came the violence. The wet cloth was beaten. In some regions, this was done by hand using wooden paddles or clubs. In others, workers trampled the cloth with their feet in large vats, a process that gave rise to the occupation of the fuller, who spent his days treading saturated fabric. In areas with access to water power, fulling mills used mechanical hammers, large wooden beams fitted with hammers that rose and fell rhythmically, pounding the cloth with far greater force and consistency than human muscle could sustain. This beating was not gentle. The cloth was subjected to repeated, violent impacts. The fibres, already loosened by the alkaline solution, were forced together. The individual strands began to tangle and mat. The structure of the weave started to collapse. The fabric shrank. This shrinkage was dramatic. A piece of cloth could lose a third of its length and width during fulling. What had been a large, loose fabric became a smaller, denser one. The spaces between threads closed. The surface of the cloth became tighter, smoother, more uniform. But shrinkage alone was not the goal. The true transformation occurred at the level of the individual fibres. Wool fibres have a scaly surface. Under a microscope, these scales look like overlapping shingles on a roof. When wool is agitated in water, particularly warm water with an alkaline agent, these scales open slightly. When the fibres are pressed together, the scales interlock, they catch on each other, they hold. This interlocking is what creates felt. The fibres are no longer just lying alongside each other in a woven pattern. They are physically tangled, locked together in a three-dimensional matrix. The distinction between warp and weft, the fundamental structure of woven cloth, begins to blur. The fabric becomes something closer to a unified mat of fibre. This felting process made the cloth windproof. The interlocked fibres left no gaps for air to pass through easily. Wind striking the surface of fulled cloth would be deflected rather than penetrating. The dense structure also made the cloth much more resistant to water. Rain landing on the surface would bead and roll off rather than soaking in immediately. The fulled cloth was not completely waterproof. If exposed to heavy rain for long enough, it would eventually become saturated. But it resisted water far better than unfulled cloth. More importantly, even when damp, fulled wool retained its insulating properties. The trapped air within the felted structure remained, and wet wool, unlike wet linen or cotton, did not cling to the skin or conduct heat away from the body as aggressively. After fulling, the cloth was often stretched on frames called tenters to dry. Wooden hooks along the frame's edges held the fabric taut, preventing it from shrinking further as it dried. This stretching also helped set the final dimensions and ensured the cloth dried flat rather than bunched or wrinkled. The surface of the dried cloth was sometimes raised, brushed with teasels, the dried seed heads of a particular plant that had hundreds of tiny hooks. This raising pulled some of the fibres to the surface, creating a slight nap that made the cloth softer against the skin and provided an additional layer of air-trapping texture. Finally, the raised nap might be sheared, trimmed with large scissors to create an even surface. This was a finishing step more common for cloth intended for formal garments than for working cloaks, but it demonstrated the level of control medieval craftspeople had over the final properties of their textile. The result of all this, the soaking, the beating, the shrinking, the felting, was a fabric that bore little resemblance to the loose-woven cloth that had come off the loom. Fulled wool was dense, heavy, resilient. It was warm even when damp, it blocked wind, it resisted tearing, it could be worn for years, subjected to harsh conditions and remain functional. This was the fabric of the shepherd's cloak. The violence of the fulling process, the pounding, the agitation, the intentional damage to the weave was what made the cloth capable of protecting a human body through a winter night in an open field. The softness of the final fabric, its warmth, its reliability, all of these came from destruction. The fibres had to be forced together, matted, felted, before they could serve their purpose. The shepherd did not need to understand the chemistry of lanolin or the microscopic structure of wool scales. He simply knew that fulled wool worked. He knew that a properly prepared cloak could keep him alive. He knew the difference between cloth that had been fulled and cloth that had not, because his survival depended on that difference. And so he wore his heavy fulled cloak night after night, trusting in the process that had transformed loose fibre into something strong enough to stand between his body and the cold. As the light faded, the shepherd surveyed the field. His task was not simply to stop wherever the flock happened to be. He had to choose a location that would serve multiple needs: containment for the animals, protection from the wind, access to materials for fire and shelter, and strategic positioning for the following day's grazing. The landscape offered information. The shepherd's ability to read that information determined how tolerable the night would be. Wind was the first consideration. The sea, direction, and strength varied, but certain patterns were predictable. In much of northern Europe, prevailing winds came from the west or southwest. The shepherd looked for natural windbreaks, a low ridge, a line of trees, a stone wall, even a slight rise in the ground that would deflect the worst of the wind's force. If the folding location allowed for choice, he positioned the enclosure on the leeward side of such features. The windward side, the side facing into the wind, would be fully exposed. The leeward side, sheltered in the feature's shadow, would experience calmer air. The difference could be significant. A moderate wind in the open might feel severe, but that same wind, blocked by a hillside or wall, would barely be noticeable on the protected side. The shepherd also observed the vegetation. Certain plants indicated specific conditions. Dense patches of heather or gorse suggested well-drained, slightly elevated ground, preferable to low-lying areas where water would collect. Sedges and rushes indicated wetland or boggy soil which would be cold, damp, and unsuitable for resting. He looked for dry ground. Damp soil conducted heat away from the body more efficiently than dry soil. Frozen ground, paradoxically, was sometimes better than wet ground because ice is a less efficient conductor than liquid water. But the best option was soil that was merely cold and dry, firm enough to support weight without compressing into mud, dry enough to not draw moisture into his clothing or cloak. Elevation mattered, but not in the way one might expect. High ground was often windier, more exposed, but very low ground could be colder, particularly on clear nights when cold air, being denser than warm air, would flow downhill and pool in valleys and hollows. These frost pockets could be several degrees colder than the surrounding terrain. The ideal position was often a middle elevation, high enough to avoid the coldest air pooling at the bottom, low enough to gain some shelter from ridges above. If the shepherd had to choose between a windy hilltop and a sheltered valley bottom, he would usually choose the valley, because the wind's effect on heat loss outweighed the slight temperature difference caused by cold air drainage. The shepherd also considered proximity to fuel. If he planned to maintain a fire through the night, he needed access to combustible material. In regions with adequate wood, he looked for deadfall, fallen branches dry enough to burn without excessive smoke. In upland areas where trees were scarce, he looked for the dried animal dung, which could be collected from the flock's earlier grazing. or for exposed peat which could be cut with a knife or spade. The availability of stone was another factor. Stone served multiple purposes: building material for a low windbreak, thermal mass for storing heat from the fire, and a stable base for constructing a small hearth. A site with accessible stones, whether loose surface rock or outcrops that could be easily broken, was preferable to a site where such material would have to be carried from a distance. Water access was less critical for the overnight watch than it would be for a longer encampment, but the shepherd noted the location of streams or springs. Sheep needed water, though in winter they often obtained sufficient moisture from dew, frost, and the vegetation they consumed. The shepherd himself might need water to drink or to dampen a cloth for washing a wound if a dog or sheep was injured. The shepherd's assessment of the site was rapid but thorough. He did not have hours to evaluate options. The light was fading, the flock needed to be enclosed. Decisions had to be made quickly based on experience and accumulated knowledge of how landscapes behaved in winter. He walked the perimeter of the proposed fold location, checking for obstacles: hidden ditches, sharp stones, thorny vegetation that might injure the sheep, holes or burrows that could trap a hoof. He noted the slope of the ground. A slight slope was acceptable, but a steep slope would make the animals restless and could cause them to cluster too heavily on the downhill side. He observed the flock's behaviour. Sheep have instincts about shelter and comfort. If they moved naturally toward a particular area, it often indicated that the spot offered some advantage: better forage, calmer air, drier ground. The shepherd did not always defer to the flock's preference, especially if the folding location was mandated by agricultural planning, but he took their behaviour as additional information. Once the site was chosen, the shepherd began to prepare. If time and materials allowed, he might construct a simple windbreak for himself, separate from the fold but close enough to monitor the animals. This windbreak did not need to be large. A low wall of stacked stones or piled turf no more than waist high, positioned to block the prevailing wind, would suffice. If no stones were available, he might use bundles of brush or heather, weighted down with whatever was at hand. The goal was not to create an enclosed space, but simply to deflect the wind, to create a pocket of calmer air, where he could rest without the constant buffeting that would strip away his warmth. The shepherd's ability to read the landscape was not innate. It was learned through repetition, through the accumulation of many cold nights and the gradual understanding of which choices led to comfort and which led to suffering. Each landscape had its own character, its own patterns of wind and drainage and cold air flow. The shepherd had to adapt his knowledge to the specific terrain he was working in. In mountainous regions, he learned to use rock outcrops and boulders as windbreaks. In open plains, he learned to dig shallow depressions in the ground, creating artificial low spots that would offer minimal protection. In forested edges, he learned which side of a grove would be warmest and which would be coldest. This knowledge was practical, specific, and entirely focused on survival. The shepherd was not contemplating the beauty of the landscape or the grandeur of nature. He was assessing resources and threats. He was making calculations that would determine whether the night ahead would be bearable or brutal. And once the assessment was complete, once the site was chosen and the preparations begun, the shepherd moved forward into the routine that would carry him through to dawn. The shepherd's shelter was not a building. It was a modification of the landscape, a deliberate arrangement of materials designed to create a zone where the wind could not reach. Wind was the primary enemy. Cold air, by itself, was manageable. The shepherd's clothing could trap enough body heat to maintain warmth even in very low temperatures, provided the air around him remained still. But moving air, wind, stripped that warmth away. It penetrated fabric, replaced the warm layer next to the skin with cold air, and forced the body to continuously generate heat to compensate. This was exhausting. Over hours, it became dangerous. The solution was deflection. The shepherd needed a barrier that would force the wind to move around him, rather than through his position. The most common form of this barrier was a low stone wall. Dry stone construction, stacking stones without mortar, was a skill widespread across medieval Europe, particularly in regions where stone was abundant and wood was scarce. The shepherd did not need to be an expert mason. He only needed to create a stable pile that would not collapse during the night. He selected flat stones, if available, because they stacked more easily and created a more solid structure. Rounded stones could be used, but they required more careful placement to prevent rolling or shifting. The stones were laid in a rough line, each one supporting the others, the weight of the upper layers pressing down to stabilise the lower ones. The wall did not need to be high. Waist height was sufficient, and often even lower walls provided adequate protection. A wall that stood 3 feet high would block the majority of horizontal wind, creating a calm zone on the leeward side. The shepherd did not need to be entirely enclosed. He only needed to remove the wind from his immediate vicinity. The length of the wall depended on available materials and time. A wall 6 to 8 feet long, curved slightly to create a partial arc, provided good protection. The curve helped deflect wind more efficiently than a straight line, and also gave the shepherd more space to adjust his position if the wind direction shifted during the night. In regions where stone was not readily available, turf was the alternative. Turf, layers of soil held together by the roots of grass and other plants, could be cut from the ground in rectangular blocks, similar to bricks. These blocks were stacked to form walls. Turf construction was slower than dry stone, because each block had to be cut and carried, but the resulting wall was often more windproof than stone. Turf had an additional advantage: insulation. The organic material in the turf, including partially decomposed plant matter, trapped air within its structure. A turf wall was not just a physical barrier to wind, it was also a thermal barrier. It absorbed some heat during the day, if any sun was available, and released it slowly during the night. The difference was small, but in the context of a long, cold night, even small advantages accumulated into something meaningful. The shepherd sometimes combined materials: a base layer of stone for stability, topped with turf for additional height and insulation, or a framework of woven branches filled in with turf or loose sod. The specific technique varied by region, by available materials, and by the shepherd's personal experience. The positioning of the wall was critical. It had to be oriented perpendicular to the prevailing wind. A wall parallel to the wind would provide no protection at all. The shepherd observed the wind direction carefully, sometimes wetting a finger and holding it up to feel which side dried fastest, indicating the wind's approach. He positioned the wall accordingly. The wall did not need to enclose the shepherd completely. A U-shaped arrangement with the open side facing away from the wind was often sufficient. This allowed the shepherd to see the flock to remain accessible, while still creating a sheltered zone. If the wind shifted direction during the night, he could move to a different section of the shelter, or adjust his position to compensate. Inside this sheltered zone, the air was noticeably calmer. The difference was perceptible immediately. The constant tug and flutter of fabric against the body ceased. The chill that came from moving air, the wind chill that made every temperature feel colder than it actually was, diminished. The shepherd's body could now warm the air around him, and that warmed air would remain, at least for a while, rather than being swept away instantly. The shelter also created a psychological benefit. The wall defined a space. It marked a boundary between the vast exposed field and a smaller, more manageable area that the shepherd controlled. This sense of enclosure, however minimal, provided comfort. It transformed the shepherd's position from a random spot in an infinite landscape into a place, a temporary home. The shepherd did not spend significant time constructing elaborate shelters unless he planned to remain in the same location for many days. For a single night, especially when the fold location changed nightly according to the fertilization plan, a simple windbreak was sufficient. It could be built in less than an hour, using materials gathered from the immediate surroundings. In some regions, where shepherds returned to the same upland pastures year after year, more permanent structures existed. These were the sheilings, seasonal dwellings made of stone or turf with low walls and turf-covered roofs. They were small, often no more than a single room, windowless, with a doorway just large enough for a person to enter. These structures were built to last for years, even decades. The walls were thicker, the construction more careful. The roof, supported by wooden beams or whalebone in treeless regions, was covered with layers of turf that provided excellent insulation. Over time, grass and other plants would grow on the roof, further stabilizing the turf and adding to the structure's ability to retain heat. Inside a sheiling, the shepherd had more options. He could build a small fire in the center of the room, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or simply permeating the turf. The walls blocked all wind. The space was small enough that body heat and the heat from the fire would gradually warm the air inside, creating a genuinely comfortable environment. But sheilings were seasonal and geographically specific. They existed in upland areas used for summer grazing, or in regions where transhumance patterns brought flocks to the same locations repeatedly. For the winter shepherd working the lowland fields near the village, moving nightly to follow the folding schedule, such structures were not available. He had to rely on temporary measures, the low stone wall, the turf windbreak, the careful positioning of his body and his cloak to maximise the protection these simple barriers provided. The architecture was minimal, but it was functional. It reduced wind exposure. It created a microclimate that was measurably warmer and calmer than the open field. It transformed an impossible situation into a difficult one, and a difficult situation into one that could be endured, and that was sufficient. The shepherd did not need comfort, he needed survival. The low wall, the deflected wind, the pocket of calm air, these provided exactly what was required, nothing more, nothing less. The turf that formed the shepherd's shelter was more than compressed earth. It was a repository of organic history. Each block contained the accumulated growth of decades, sometimes centuries. Grass roots woven through soil, plant matter in various stages of decomposition, fungi, bacteria, tiny invertebrates, all of these compressed together into a dense, fibrous mass that had remarkable properties. Turf was harvested from moorland or boggy areas where vegetation grew thick and continuous. The shepherd, if he was cutting fresh turf for his windbreak, would use a spade or a specialised turf cutting tool to slice through the surface layer. Each cut produced a rectangular block, roughly the size of a brick but lighter in weight. The blocks were firm enough to hold their shape when stacked, yet flexible enough to conform slightly to the blocks beneath them, creating a stable wall. The key to turf's value as a building material was its structure. The plant roots, still intact in the freshly cut block, acted as reinforcement. They held the soil together, preventing it from crumbling or disintegrating. As the turf dried, these roots tightened, shrinking slightly but maintaining their binding function. A properly cut turf block could last for months without collapsing, and in permanent structures, turf walls could endure for years. But turf's greatest asset was not its structural integrity, it was its ability to insulate. The organic matter within the turf trapped air in countless tiny pockets throughout the block's volume. Air is an excellent insulator, and when it is held motionless within a solid matrix, it cannot carry heat away through convection. A turf wall was therefore far more effective at preventing heat loss than a stone wall of equivalent thickness. This insulating property worked in both directions. During the day, if any sunlight struck the turf wall, the dark surface would absorb heat. This heat would penetrate slowly into the turf's mass, warming the interior of the blocks. At night, as the air temperature dropped, the stored heat would be released gradually, radiating back out into the space behind the wall. The effect was subtle. A turf windbreak did not create a warm enclosure, but it did moderate the temperature in the sheltered zone, making it slightly less cold than the surrounding field. Over the course of a long night, this difference accumulated. The shepherd's body, already working to maintain its core temperature, did not have to work quite as hard. The margin between sustainable discomfort and dangerous cold was widened, just slightly, by the thermal properties of the turf. In regions where peat was prevalent, the turf had additional qualities. Peat is partially decomposed plant material, accumulated over centuries in waterlogged conditions that prevent full decay. It is dense, rich in carbon, and has a spongy texture that compresses under weight, but springs back when the pressure is removed. Peat-rich turf was particularly valuable for insulation. The partially decomposed organic matter contained even more trapped air than regular turf, and its dark colour absorbed more solar heat during the day. When dried, peat became remarkably light for its volume, making it easier to handle and stack than soil-heavy turf. The shepherd did not always cut fresh turf for each night's windbreak. In areas where he had worked before, where previous shepherds had constructed temporary shelters, he might find old turf blocks still intact. These older blocks, having dried and settled, were often more stable than fresh-cut ones. They could be reused, stacked again in a new configuration, serving multiple generations of shepherds before finally crumbling back into the earth. The construction of a turf wall required some care. The blocks could not simply be piled haphazardly. Each layer had to be staggered, like bricks in a permanent building, so that the joints did not align vertically. This staggering distributed weight and prevented the wall from developing weak vertical planes where it might split or collapse. The The first layer was placed directly on the ground, pressed firmly into contact with the soil. This base layer had to be level, or nearly so, to prevent the entire structure from leaning. Subsequent layers were placed with the grass side down, the cut soil side up, so that each block's roots helped bind it to the layer below. As the wall rose, the shepherd occasionally used his foot or the flat of his spade to compress the layers together, ensuring good contact and stability. A well-built turf wall, even a temporary one, would feel solid. It would not shift or wobble when pushed. It would stand through the night without maintenance. The top of the wall was sometimes finished with blocks placed grass side up, creating a slightly softer cap. This was not necessary for structural reasons, but it prevented loose soil from the topmost blocks from crumbling down onto the shepherd during the night. The thickness of a turf wall varied depending on available material and the severity of the weather. A single layer of blocks, roughly 6 to 8 inches thick, provided basic wind protection. A double layer, 12 to 16 inches thick, offered significantly better insulation and stability. In permanent sheilings, walls could be 2 or even 3 blocks thick, creating structures that were genuinely warm inside when combined with body heat and a small fire. The turf wall also served an acoustic function. It dampened sound. The wind, which in the open field created a constant background noise, a rushing or whistling or howling depending on its strength, was muffled behind the turf barrier. This reduction in noise made it easier for the shepherd to hear other sounds. The movement of the sheep, the alert bark of the dog, the approach of a predator or intruder. The silence created by the wall was not complete, but it was noticeable. The shepherd could rest in a quieter environment, which reduced mental fatigue. The constant sensory assault of wind against the ears was exhausting, even when not consciously noticed. Its absence allowed for deeper rest, even while maintaining the vigilance required for the watch. Turf was also used as flooring. In some cases, the shepherd would lay turf blocks on the ground inside his sheltered area, creating a slightly raised platform that separated him from direct contact with the cold earth. The turf provided both insulation and a modest amount of cushioning. It was softer than bare ground, more comfortable for extended resting, and it absorbed some of the ground's moisture, keeping the underside of the cloak drier. The use of turf in the way, as wall and as floor, demonstrated the material's versatility. It was abundant in many pastoral regions. It required no specialised tools beyond a spade. It could be worked quickly, and it provided multiple benefits: structural integrity, thermal insulation, sound dampening, and moisture management. The shepherd understood these properties through experience rather than theory. He knew that turf walls felt warmer than stone walls. He knew that a turf-lined sleeping area was more comfortable than bare ground. He knew that older, drier turf was lighter and easier to work with than fresh-cut blocks. This knowledge was accumulated over many seasons. It was refined through cold nights when certain configurations worked better than others. It was shared sometimes between shepherds who encountered each other in the field or who worked for the same estate. But mostly it was personal, individual, learned through the direct experience of survival. The turf itself eventually returned to the earth. A temporary windbreak, abandoned after a single night, would gradually erode. Rain would soften the blocks. Frost would crack them. Vegetation would begin to grow through them, roots breaking the compressed structure apart. Within a season or two, the wall would be indistinguishable from the surrounding land, its material reabsorbed into the cycle of growth and decay that had originally created it. But for the night it was needed. The turf served. It stood as a barrier. It trapped warmth. It created the margin of safety that allowed the shepherd to endure. And in the morning, when he moved on to the next location, the turf remained behind, a temporary monument to the night's survival, slowly beginning its return to the moor. The light was fading. The shepherd rose from wherever he had been resting during the late afternoon and began the work of bringing the flock together. The sheep, scattered across the pasture or stubble field in loose clusters, had spent the day grazing. Their movements had been slow, methodical, heads down, cropping the remaining vegetation. Now, as the temperature began to drop and the shadows lengthened, it was time to gather them into the fold. The shepherd did not rush. Rushing would only agitate the animals, make them nervous and difficult to manage. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, his staff in hand, the dog alert at his side. The dog knew this routine. It had performed this task hundreds of times. The shepherd gave a low whistle, or a quiet word, and the dog moved out, circling wide around the flock's perimeter. The sheep, seeing the dog's movement, began to draw together instinctively. They did not flee, they were accustomed to the dog's presence, but they responded to it, moving away from the dog's position and toward the shepherd. This was controlled pressure. The dog applied it carefully, never too fast and never too aggressive. If a sheep broke away from the group, the dog adjusted its position, cutting off the escape route, gently guiding the animal back to the main body of the flock. The shepherd watched, occasionally giving a command, a word, a gesture to direct the dog's movement. Gradually, the scattered clusters merged into a single group. The sheep moved together now, a flowing mass of wool and bodies, heads turning, ears flicking, eyes watching the dog and the shepherd. They knew where they were going. This happened every evening. The fold was familiar, even if its exact location changed from night to night. The shepherd positioned himself at the point where he wanted the flock to move. The fold's entrance, if it was a temporary structure, was simply a gap in the hurdles or stone walls that defined the enclosure. The shepherd stood to one side of this gap, his presence marking it as the destination. The dog, working behind the flock, moved them forward. The sheep entered the fold in a steady stream, not hurrying, each animal following the one ahead of it. The shepherd counted them as they passed. He knew the flock's size, knew how many animals there should be, and he watched for any sign that one was missing or injured. Once the last sheep had entered, the shepherd closed the gap. If the fold was made of hurdles, he moved a section into place, blocking the opening. If it was stone or turf, he might stack additional blocks or drag a thorn bush across the entrance to create a physical barrier. The closure did not need to be perfect. Sheep are not inclined to escape at night, especially when they are grouped together and feel secure, but the barrier served as a deterrent, and more importantly, it prevented the flock from wandering out if something disturbed them during the night. Inside the fold, the sheep began to settle. They moved around for a few minutes, jostling for position, establishing their places within the group. Sheep have a strong flocking instinct, and when enclosed, they naturally press together. This closeness was not just social, it was thermal. Each animal benefited from the warmth of the bodies around it. The shepherd observed their behaviour. If the sheep were calm, settling quickly, it indicated that they felt secure. If they remained restless, moving constantly, not lying down, it suggested that something was wrong. A predator nearby, an unfamiliar scent, discomfort from the enclosure's size or condition. He adjusted as needed. If the fold seemed too small, causing the animals to be overly compressed and uncomfortable, he might widen it slightly, though this had to be balanced against the need for concentration to ensure proper manure distribution. If the sheep seemed nervous, he would spend more time nearby, his presence and the dog's presence providing reassurance. The fold's size was determined by practical calculation. Too small and the sheep would be stressed, unable to lie down comfortably. Too large and the manure would be spread too thin, reducing its effectiveness as fertilizer. The ideal density was one that allowed each animal enough space to rest while ensuring that the ground within the fold would be thoroughly covered with droppings by morning. The shepherd's experience told him what this density looked like. He could assess it by eye, watching how the animals distributed themselves, whether they had room to move or were pressed too tightly together. If he had folded flocks in this field before, he knew roughly how much space was needed. If it was a new location, he made his best estimate and adjusted in subsequent nights if necessary. The fold's position within the field was not chosen by the shepherd, as has been noted, but by the agricultural plan. However, within the designated area, he had some discretion. He could shift the fold's location by a few meters to avoid a particularly wet spot or to take advantage of a slight rise that would provide better drainage. These small adjustments improved the animals' comfort and, by extension, their health and productivity. Once the sheep were enclosed and beginning to settle, the shepherd turned his attention to his own needs. He checked the perimeter of the fold, looking for any weaknesses in the walls or hurdles that might allow a predator to enter. He reinforced sections if necessary, adding stones or tightening the woven branches of the hurdles. He noted the positions of his dog. The dog would not stay in one place all night. It would patrol, moving around the fold's perimeter, lying down at intervals, rising again to check different areas. The dog's presence was a deterrent, and its movement ensured that no predator could approach from a blind spot and remain undetected. The shepherd gathered the materials he would need for the night. If he planned to build a fire, he collected fuel now, while there was still enough light to see. He arranged his cloak, checking for any damage that would need repair. He located the stones he would use for his windbreak or for heating if he intended to use the thermal mass technique. He drank water if he had any, ate a small meal if he had brought food. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, perhaps dried meat. Enough to sustain him through the night, but not so much that digestion would make him drowsy. He needed to remain alert, or at least capable of alertness if something required his attention. As the darkness deepened, the shepherd completed his preparations. The flock was now quiet, most of the animals lying down, their bodies pressed together in a dense mass. Their collective breathing created a low, steady sound, rhythmic and continuous. The temperature was dropping. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky, which meant the night would be cold. Clear skies allowed heat to radiate away from the earth without the insulating effect of clouds. The shepherd positioned himself at the fold's entrance. This was his place, the position he would maintain through the night. He spread his cloak, arranged whatever padding or insulation he had gathered, and settled into the posture he would hold for hours. The ritual was complete. The flock was folded. The shepherd was in position. The dog was alert. The night stretched ahead and the watch began. Inside the fold, the sheep were transforming the enclosure into a source of heat. This transformation was not immediate. It took time for the animals to settle fully, for their metabolic activity to stabilize, for the warmth they generated to accumulate in the confined space. But gradually, as the night progressed and the temperature outside continued to drop, the fold became noticeably warmer than the surrounding field. Sheep are well adapted to cold. Their wool provides exceptional insulation, trapping air close to the skin and creating a barrier against heat loss. A sheep in winter with a full fleece can remain comfortable in temperatures well below freezing. The animal's metabolism generates heat continuously, a byproduct of digestion and the basic cellular processes that sustain life. When a sheep is alone, this heat is lost to the environment. The warm air trapped in the fleece eventually escapes, replaced by the cold air. The animal remains warm, but it must continuously produce heat to compensate for what is lost. This is energetically expensive. It requires the sheep to consume more food to fuel the increased metabolic rate. But when sheep are grouped together in a confined space, the dynamic changes. The animals press close to one another. Their bodies are in contact, or nearly so. The warm air escaping from one animal's fleece does not immediately dissipate into the cold night air. Instead, it is trapped in the space between bodies, held by the surrounding animals. This air, already warmed by one sheep, warms the adjacent sheep, reducing the amount of heat that sheep needs to generate on its own. The effect multiplies as more animals are added to the group. Each sheep contributes heat. Each sheep benefits from the heat of the others. The center of the group, where animals are surrounded on all sides, becomes the warmest area. The periphery, where animals are exposed on one side to the outside and air, is cooler but still warmer than it would be if the animal were alone. This collective heat generation is instinctive. Sheep do not consciously decide to huddle for warmth. They are driven by a flocking instinct, a deep behavioral pattern that prioritizes staying with the group. But the result of this instinct, when the group is confined in winter, is a significant thermal advantage. The fold amplified this effect. The walls, whether stone or turf, prevented the warm air from escaping horizontally. The air warmed by the sheep rose, but instead of dissipating into the open sky, it was partially trapped by the density of the flock itself and by the still air above the fold. The result was a pocket of warmer air that persisted through the night. The temperature inside the fold was not warm by human standards. It was not comfortable, but it was measurably higher than the outside air. On a night when the field temperature dropped to several degrees below freezing, the air inside the fold might remain near freezing, or even slightly above. This difference, small as it was significant for survival. The shepherd, positioned at the fold's entrance, had direct access to this warmth. He was not inside the fold, not surrounded by sheep, but he was at the boundary. The warm air escaping from the entrance flowed past him. The radiant heat from the nearest animals reached him. His position was the warmest point outside the fold, the place where the flock's collective furnace was most accessible. This was not an accident. The shepherd's choice to lie across the entrance was deliberate. It was a strategic decision that served multiple purposes. It provided security, prevented escape and maximised his access to the flock's warmth. He was quite literally positioned at the interface between the cold outside world and the warmer interior space created by the animals. The shepherd could regulate his exposure to this warmth. If he became too warm, a rare occurrence, but possible if the fold was particularly well sheltered and the flock was large, he could shift his position slightly, moving away from the entrance. If he was too cold, he could move closer, even positioning part of his body just inside the fold, his legs or back pressed against the nearest sheep. The sheep tolerated this proximity. They were accustomed to the shepherd's presence. His scent was familiar. His movements, when they occurred, were slow and non-threatening. The animals near the entrance might shift position slightly when the shepherd moved, but they did not panic or try to escape. They accepted him as part of the fold's structure, another warm body in the collective mass. The density of the flock was critical to this thermal effect. If the fold was too large and the animals too spread out, the heat would dissipate before it could accumulate. If the fold was too small and the animals overly compressed, they would become uncomfortable, restless, and the constant movement would disrupt the stable warm zone. The shepherd's experience told him the correct density. He had observed over many nights what configuration produced the best results. He knew that a tightly packed flock generated more warmth, but required careful monitoring to ensure the animals were not distressed. He knew that a loosely packed flock was calmer, but provided less heat. He balanced these factors based on the night's conditions. On a relatively mild night, he might allow more space. On a bitterly cold night, he would accept a higher density, knowing the increased warmth was necessary for his own survival. The flock's warmth was sustained through the night by the animal's continuous metabolic activity. Sheep, like all ruminants, have a complex digestive system that ferments plant material in the rumen, the largest chamber of the stomach. This fermentation process generates significant heat as a byproduct. A well-fed sheep with a rumen full of forage produces warmth continuously even while resting. The shepherd ensured the flock had grazed adequately during the day. Well-fed animals generated more heat at night. Underfed animals, with less material to ferment, produced less warmth and were more vulnerable to cold stress. The shepherd's daytime management of the flock's grazing thus directly affected his nighttime survival conditions. The collective furnace was most effective in the deepest part of the night, when the outside temperature reached its lowest point. During these hours, typically well after midnight and before dawn, the contrast between the fold's interior and the surrounding field was greatest. The shepherd, if he woke or if he had remained conscious, could feel this difference acutely. The air flowing from the fold was noticeably warmer against his face than the air coming from behind him. This warmth was gentle, not intense. It did not make the shepherd comfortable, but it made survival possible. It was the difference between a night that could be endured and a night that would result in hypothermia. The flock's collective biological heat, concentrated in the fold and accessed by the shepherd through his strategic position, was one of the most essential elements of the entire survival system. The sheep themselves benefited as well. The collective warmth reduced the energy each animal needed to expend to maintain its body temperature. This conservation of energy meant the animals remained healthier, lost less weight over the winter, and were in better condition for lambing in the spring. The system was mutually beneficial, though the sheep were unaware of their role in keeping the shepherd alive. As dawn approached and the temperature began to rise slightly with the sun's eventual return, the thermal advantage of the fold diminished. The difference between inside and outside decreased, but by then the night was nearly over. The shepherd had survived the coldest hours. The flock would soon be released to graze again. The fold's function as a furnace would end until the next evening, when the cycle would repeat. The shepherd's position at the fold's entrance was more than strategic placement. It was a statement of responsibility, a physical embodiment of his role. In the pastoral traditions that stretched back centuries before the medieval period, the sheepfold was designed with a single opening. This was intentional. Multiple entrances would have been difficult to secure, would have created confusion for the animals, and would have divided the shepherd's attention. A single entrance concentrated all movement, all potential threats, all access into one controllable point. And at this point the shepherd placed himself. He did not sit beside the entrance, he did not stand guard near it. He lay down across it, his body forming a physical barrier that closed the gap. Nothing could enter without stepping over him. Nothing could leave without waking him. He became quite literally the door of the sheep. This position served an immediate practical function: security. The fold's walls, whether stone or woven hurdles, were sufficient to contain calm animals, but would not stop a determined predator. A wolf, a bear, even a large dog could potentially breach the walls if sufficiently motivated. But the entrance, the designed opening, was where an intruder would naturally attempt to enter. It was the path of least resistance. By placing his body across this path, the shepherd ensured that any approach would be detected. He might be resting, his eyes closed, his breathing slow, but he was not deeply asleep. The cold alone prevented deep sleep. The discomfort of his position, lying on hard ground with only his cloak for padding, kept him in a light, easily broken rest. Any disturbance, a footfall, a change in the dog's breathing, a restless movement from the flock, would bring him instantly alert. His position across the entrance meant that he would be the first line of defense, his body interposed between the threat and the animals he was charged with protecting. This was not symbolic. It was tactical. The shepherd accepted physical risk as part of his role. If a wolf approached, it would encounter him first. If thieves came in the night, they would have to deal with his presence before they could reach the sheep. His body was both barrier and alarm system. But this position served another equally important function. It maximised his access to the flock's warmth. The fold's entrance was where the warm air generated by the sheep's collective metabolism escaped most readily. The animals, pressed together inside the enclosure, heated the air around them. This air, being warmer and therefore less dense than the cold air outside, rose. But as it rose, some of it flowed out through the entrance, the only significant opening in the structure. The shepherd, lying across this opening, was positioned directly in the path of this escaping warmth. The air flowed over and around him. The radiant heat from the nearest sheep reached him. He was close enough to feel the subtle temperature difference, close enough to benefit from the thermal energy that would otherwise have simply dissipated into the night. This placement was not accidental. Shepherds across different regions and different time periods adopted similar positions. The practice was not written down in manuals or taught in formal instruction. It was discovered independently, repeatedly through trial and error. Shepherds who slept farther from the flock were colder. Shepherds who slept at the entrance were warmer. The knowledge spread through observation and emulation. The shepherd's posture while lying in this position was specific. He did not lie flat on his back, vulnerable and fully exposed. He lay on his side, legs drawn up slightly, arms close to his body. This position reduced his surface area, minimizing heat loss. It also allowed him to spring up quickly if needed, transitioning from rest to alertness in a single motion. This was sometimes called the lion pose, named for the alert resting position of predatory animals that must remain ready even while conserving energy. The shepherd, like the lion, was resting but not relaxed. His muscles were ready. His senses, though dampened by the need for rest, remained partially engaged. The shepherd's cloak was arranged to maximize both warmth and readiness. One portion was spread beneath him, insulating him from the ground. The remainder was wrapped around his body, covering his torso and legs, with the hood pulled over his head. The cloak was not tucked tightly. It was loose enough that he could throw it off and stand in a single, fluid movement if the situation demanded. His staff lay beside him, within immediate reach. His dog was nearby, sometimes lying against his back or legs, sharing warmth, sometimes positioned a few feet away, maintaining its own watch. The dog's position varied through the night as it made its rounds, but it always returned to proximity with the shepherd, the partnership between them maintained even in rest. The shepherd's presence at the entrance also had a psychological effect on the flock. Sheep are prey animals, instinctively nervous about predators. The fold's walls provided some sense of security, but the open entrance was a potential vulnerability. The shepherd's body blocking that opening completed the enclosure. It signalled to the flock that the entrance was defended, that they were safe. This may seem like anthropomorphizing, attributing human reasoning to animals, but sheep do respond to the presence of their guardian. A flock with a shepherd and dog nearby is measurably calmer than a flock left alone. The animals lie down more readily, ruminate more peacefully, show fewer signs of stress. The shepherd's position at the entrance contributed to this calm, which in turn made the flock easier to manage and less likely to panic if a minor disturbance occurred. The position also had symbolic weight, though the shepherd himself likely did not think in such terms. He was a guardian, a keeper of valuable animals, and his physical placement expressed the totality of that commitment. He gave his body as protection. He positioned himself at the point of maximum vulnerability. He accepted cold, discomfort, and risk as the necessary components of his role. This image, the shepherd lying across the doorway, wrapped in wool, one hand on his staff, his dog beside him, the flock warm and quiet behind him, was the essential picture of medieval pastoral life in winter. It was repeated every night, in countless fields, across centuries. It was not dramatic, it was not heroic in any traditional sense. It was simply the quiet, sustained fulfillment of duty. The shepherd would remain in this position for hours. He might shift occasionally, adjusting his cloak, changing which side he lay on, to relieve pressure points, but he would not leave the entrance unguarded. His vigilance was constant, even in rest. His body served as both shield and thermometer, absorbing the flock's warmth, while simultaneously protecting them from the dangers of the night. And in the morning, when the cold began to ease and the light returned, the shepherd would rise from this position, stiff and weary, but having successfully completed another night's watch. He would open the fold, release the flock to graze, and the cycle would begin again. The shepherd was not alone in his vigil. Beside him, or near him, or patrolling the fold's perimeter, was the dog. This was not a pet. It was a working animal, bred and trained for a specific purpose, to protect livestock from predators and to assist in managing the flock's movements. The relationship between shepherd and dog was one of mutual dependence, forged through constant proximity and shared responsibility. The dogs used for this work were large, powerful animals. They needed to be substantial enough to confront wolves, bears, and other large predators that inhabited the European wilderness. Breeds varied by region. The Carpathian shepherd dog in Eastern Europe, the Pyrenean mountain dog in the south, various livestock guardian breeds across the Mediterranean and British Isles, but they shared common characteristics: size, strength, thick coats, and a protective temperament. These dogs were not herding dogs. Herding dogs, smaller and more agile, were used to move flocks from place to place, nipping at heels, circling, controlling, direction through quick movements and strategic positioning. Livestock guardian dogs served a different function. They lived with the flock constantly, bonding with the sheep from puppyhood, perceiving the flock as their family group to be defended against outsiders. The dog's presence was a deterrent. Predators, approaching under cover of darkness, would detect the dog's scent or hear its warning bark long before they reached the fold. Most predators, unless desperately hungry, would choose to avoid a confrontation. The risk of injury from a large, aggressive dog protecting its territory was often not worth the potential meal. But the dog's value went beyond simple deterrence. It served as an early warning system for the shepherd. The shepherd could not remain fully alert through the entire night. Human beings need sleep. Even in uncomfortable conditions, the body will eventually demand rest, and consciousness will fade, at least partially. But the dog's sleep patterns were different. Dogs are lighter sleepers than humans, capable of waking instantly at the smallest disturbance. They also sleep in shorter cycles, alternating periods of rest with periods of alertness. The shepherd learned to monitor the dog's behaviour even while resting himself, and he could hear the dog's breathing, the rhythm of it changing when the animal became alert. He could sense the dog's movement, the shift from lying still to standing, or the low rumble that preceded a bark. These signals would wake him or would prevent him from falling into deeper sleep at critical moments. The dog, in turn, was attuned to the shepherd. It watched him, checked on him periodically during its rounds, positioned itself near him when not actively patrolling. The partnership was bidirectional. Each monitored the other. Each responded to the other's signals. This communication was mostly non-verbal. The shepherd might give a low whistle or a quiet word to direct the dog's attention to a particular area, to call it back if it wandered too far, or to calm it if it became unnecessarily agitated. But much of the time, no words were needed. The dog understood its role. The shepherd trusted the dog to perform it. The dog's vigilance was particularly important during the hours when the shepherd was most vulnerable, the deep middle of the night, when cold and exhaustion made it difficult to maintain full awareness. During these hours, the dog was often the more alert of the two. It moved around the fold, checking the perimeter, sniffing the air for unfamiliar scents, listening for sounds that did not belong. If the dog detected a threat, its response was graduated. For a minor disturbance, a small animal passing nearby, a distant sound, it might simply raise its head, ears forward, listening. For a more significant concern, an unfamiliar scent approaching, the movement of a large animal, it would stand, position itself between the threat and the flock, and issue a low warning growl. If the threat persisted or advanced closer, the dog would bark. This bark was not frantic or continuous. It was a series of deep-spaced barks, loud enough to be heard at a distance, designed to warn the intruder that it had been detected and that continued approach would be met with resistance. The bark also served to wake the shepherd fully, if he was resting, and to alert him to the direction of the threat. The shepherd would rise, staff in hand, and assess the situation. Often the dog's warning alone was sufficient. The predator or intruder would retreat. If not, the shepherd and dog together would present a more formidable defence than either could alone. There were occasions when the dog had to fight. Wolves, particularly in hard winters when prey was scarce, might risk confrontation. A determined wolf could be a serious threat, and a pack of wolves even more so. The dog, though large and powerful, could be injured or killed in such encounters. The shepherd would intervene to support the dog, using his staff as a weapon, throwing stones, shouting to intimidate the predator. But the dog often bore the initial brunt of the confrontation, placing itself between the threat and the flock, willing to engage physically if necessary. This was the core of the guardian dog's purpose, to fight if needed, to protect the animals it lived with. But most nights did not involve such drama. Most nights were quiet. The dog's presence alone was enough. The predators stayed away. The dog patrolled, rested, patrolled again. The shepherd slept lightly, woke occasionally to check the dog's position and behaviour, then rested again. The dog also provided warmth. Its thick coat, bred for cold climates, trapped substantial body heat. When the dog lay down beside the shepherd, or against his back, the warmth was shared. The contact was comforting in a practical sense. Additional heat, additional insulation, but also in a psychological sense. The shepherd was not entirely alone. There was another living presence, a companion in the isolation of the winter field. Dogs, like humans, seek warmth when cold. A dog will often curl into a tight ball, tucking its nose under its tail, minimizing exposed surface area. This position, sometimes called the donut pose, conserves the dog's body heat efficiently. When a dog slept in this position against the shepherd benefited from the dog's warmth, and the dog benefited from the shepherd's warmth. The exchange was mutual. The relationship between shepherd and dog was not sentimental, but it was genuine. The shepherd relied on the dog in its own way relied on the shepherd. They were partners in a shared task, each possessing skills the other lacked, each making the other's survival more likely. The shepherd cared for the dog as he cared for the flock, practically, attentively, recognizing its value. He ensured the dog was fed, though food was often scarce and the dog was expected to supplement its diet by scavenging. He monitored the dog's health, treating minor injuries with the same methods he used for the sheep, cleaning wounds, applying poultices, resting the animal when necessary. The dog, for its part, performed its role without hesitation. It did not question or refuse. It simply did what it had been bred and trained to do, night after night, season after season, till age or injury or illness ended its service. When a guardian dog died, it was a significant loss. A new dog would have to be trained, which took time. Until then, the shepherd's task was more difficult, more dangerous. The absence of the dog's vigilance meant the shepherd could rest less, had to maintain higher alertness, face greater risk from predators. But when the partnership was intact, when the dog was healthy and the shepherd experienced, the two-being unit functioned with remarkable efficiency. The shepherd provided direction, judgment, and the ability to use tools and fire. The dog provided acute senses, physical strength, and tireless vigilance. Together, they created a defense system that allowed the flock to survive in an environment filled with threats. The silent partnership, played out in darkness and cold, was one of the essential relationships of medieval pastoral life. It was not celebrated in songs or recorded in documents. It was simply lived night after night in fields across Europe, wherever sheep were kept and shepherds watched over them through the winter dark. The shepherd built his fire with care, not enthusiasm. A large fire would have been visible from a distance, announcing his position to anyone moving through the night. It would have consumed his limited fuel rapidly, requiring constant attention and replenishment. It would have created harsh contrasts of light and shadow that made it difficult to see beyond the immediate circle of illumination. And it would have disturbed the flock, the flames and crackling causing unease among animals whose instinct was to flee from fire. So the shepherd kept his fire small. He began by selecting a location. If he had built a windbreak, he positioned the fire just inside it, sheltered from the wind but with enough space that the smoke would not blow directly into his resting area. If no windbreak existed, he might dig a shallow depression in the ground, creating a natural hollow that would contain the fire and reduce its visibility. The depression served multiple purposes. It protected the flames from wind, which would otherwise cause them to flare and consume fuel too quickly. It contained the heat, concentrating it in a smaller area, and it lowered the fire's profile, making it less visible from a distance while still providing warmth to anyone positioned directly above it. The shepherd gathered his fuel carefully. In regions where wood was available, he looked for dry deadfall, small branches, twigs, pieces of bark. The wood needed to be thoroughly dry. Damp wood produced excessive smoke and burned poorly, wasting effort and creating a visible signal. He tested pieces by breaking them, listening for the sharp crack that indicated dryness rather than the soft bend of moisture-laden wood. He collected more than he thought he would need, knowing that estimating fuel consumption in the dark was difficult. Better to have excess than to run out in the coldest hours before dawn. He stacked the gathered material within reach of where he would rest, organised by size, tinder, kindling and larger pieces that would burn longer. Starting the fire required patience. The shepherd used a fire steel and flint, striking them together to produce sparks. These sparks fell onto a prepared bed of tinder. Dry grass, shredded bark, perhaps a piece of charcloth if he had prepared it earlier. The tinder would catch, glowing at first rather than flaming. The shepherd would bend close, blowing gently to feed oxygen to the ember, encouraging it to spread and strengthen. Once the tinder was burning with a small flame, he added the finest kindling, piece by piece, allowing each to catch before adding the next. Rushing this process would smother the flame. The key was patience, building the fire gradually from a tiny flame to something sustainable. When the kindling was burning steadily, he added slightly larger pieces of wood, crisscrossed to allow air circulation. The fire grew, but the shepherd did not let it grow large. He added fuel sparingly, maintaining a low flame rather than allowing a vigorous blaze. The fire he created was more ember than flame. After the initial building phase, he let the flames die down, leaving glowing coals that radiated steady heat without bright light. These coals required less fuel to maintain and produced more usable warmth per unit of wood than active flames did. The heat from embers is radiant heat. It travels in straight lines from the hot surface, warming anything in its path. The shepherd positioned himself close enough to feel this warmth on his face and hands, but not so close that the heat became uncomfortable or posed a risk of igniting his clothing. The fire's warmth was greatest on the side facing the coals. The shepherd's back, turned away from the fire, remained cold. This imbalance was unavoidable. He managed it by periodically turning, warming one side and then the other, never allowing either side to become thoroughly cold. The fire also provided psychological comfort. The glow of embers in the darkness was reassuring, a marker of human presence in the vast night. It created a small zone of controlled light, pushing back the absolute darkness that otherwise surrounded the shepherd. This light was dim, barely enough to see by, but it was sufficient to distinguish shapes and movement in the immediate vicinity. The fire served as a deterrent to predators, though its effectiveness varied. Most nocturnal animals are wary of fire, associating it with danger. The glow, the smell of smoke, the occasional pop or shift of burning wood, all of these signalled human presence and prompted caution. A wolf or bear detecting the fire might circle at a distance but would rarely approach directly. However, desperately hungry predators might overcome this wariness. The fire alone could not guarantee safety. It was one element in a larger system of protection that included the dog, the shepherd's vigilance, and the physical barriers of the fold. The shepherd managed his fire to last through the critical hours. He did not try to maintain it all night. Fuel was too precious, and the effort of constant tending would have prevented rest. Instead, he built the fire in the early evening, maintained it through the coldest middle hours, and allowed it to die down toward dawn when the temperature would begin to rise. The timing was based on experience. The coldest part of the night typically occurred several hours after midnight, when the earth had been radiating heat into the clear sky for many hours and the sun was still far from returning. This was when the shepherd needed warmth most, when his body's ability to maintain core temperature was most challenged. During these hours, he would add small pieces of fuel to the coals periodically, just enough to maintain the ember glow without creating flame. He might do this without fully waking, the routine so ingrained that he could perform it in a state of semi-consciousness. The fire's smoke rising into the cold night air carried the scent of burning wood. This scent was comforting to the shepherd, familiar, associated with warmth and human habitation. But it also carried information to anyone downwind. Other shepherds, solitary travellers, or those with less benign intentions could detect the smoke and locate its source. This was one reason the shepherd kept his fire small. A large fire produced more smoke, visible and detectable from greater distances. A small fire, particularly one that had been allowed to become mostly embers, produced minimal smoke, just enough to maintain the heat without announcing the shepherd's position broadly. The fire required a boundary to prevent it from spreading. The shepherd often surrounded his fire with stones, creating a ring that contained the embers and prevented burning material from rolling out onto dry grass or straw. These stones also served another function, which the shepherd exploited deliberately. The stones absorbed heat from the fire. As the evening progressed and the fire matured into coals, these stones would become quite hot. The shepherd would leave them in place, allowing them to continue absorbing heat, storing thermal energy that would be released later. This transformation of active fire into stored heat was one of the shepherd's key techniques for extending warmth through the night. The fire itself would eventually die, but the stones would remain hot for hours, providing gentle, radiant warmth long after the last ember had faded. The shepherd also used fire for practical tasks beyond warmth. If he had food, he might warm it briefly over the coals. If he needed to soften leather for a repair, the fire's heat would make the material more pliable. If his hands became too cold to function properly, he would hold them near the embers until sensation returned and he could work again. But these uses were secondary. The primary purpose of the fire was psychological and thermal support. It provided just enough warmth to make the night bearable, just enough light to reduce the oppressive weight of total darkness, and just enough deterrent effect to make predators think twice about approaching. The fire was not salvation, it was support. It was one component in the shepherd's survival system, effective when combined with his clothing, his shelter, his position relative to the flock, and his dog's vigilance. Alone it would have been insufficient. But as part of the integrated whole, it made the crucial difference between enduring discomfort and succumbing to cold. The stones surrounding the shepherd's fire were not decorative. They were tools, carefully positioned to serve a specific function that would extend beyond the fire's active life. Stone has a high thermal mass. This means it can absorb substantial amounts of heat and retain that heat for long periods. The rate at which stone releases its stored heat is slow, providing steady, gentle warmth for hours after the heat source has been removed. The shepherd understood this property through experience, not through any scientific explanation. He knew that a stone heated in a fire would remain hot long after the flames died. He knew that this stored heat could be used, could be positioned, could become a source of warmth when all other sources had failed. The process began while the fire was still burning strongly. The shepherd would select stones of appropriate size, not so small that they would heat and cool too quickly, not so large that they would be impossible to move. Stones roughly the size of a fist or slightly larger were ideal. These stones were placed directly in the fire, nestled among the burning wood or coals. They would be left there for a substantial time, often an hour or more, allowing the heat to penetrate deep into the stone's mass. The surface of the stone would become too hot to touch. The interior would warm more slowly, but eventually the entire stone would reach a high temperature. Not all stones were suitable for this treatment. Some types of rock, particularly those that had absorbed water, could crack or even explode when heated rapidly. The shepherd learned which stones in his region were safe to use. Igneous rocks, granite, basalt, were generally reliable. Sedimentary rocks that had been exposed to moisture were more risky. He also avoided placing cold, wet stones directly into hot fires. The thermal shock could cause fracturing. Instead, stones would be positioned near the fire first, allowed to warm gradually, then moved into the hottest zone once they had dried and pre-warmed. Once the stones were thoroughly heated, the shepherd would remove them from the fire. This required care. The stones were intensely hot, capable of causing severe burns on contact. He would use a stick to roll them out of the coals, or he would use a piece of wood as a lever to shift them to the side. He would then wrap the hot stones. The wrapping served two purposes. It prevented direct contact with skin or fabric that could be burned, and it slowed the rate of heat loss, allowing the stone to release its warmth more gradually. The wrapping material was typically wool, since wool is remarkably resistant to heat damage compared to other fabrics. A scrap of old cloth, a worn piece of clothing no longer suitable for wearing, or even a thick layer of the shepherd's cloak could serve. The stone was placed in the centre of the fabric, which was then folded over it and secured. Some shepherds dampened the wrapping cloth slightly before wrapping the stone. The moisture would be converted to steam by the stone's heat, and the steam would help distribute warmth more evenly through the wrapping. However, this technique required careful management, as too much moisture would make the wrapping uncomfortable and wet. Once wrapped, the hot stones were positioned strategically. The shepherd might place one near his core, tucked inside his clothing against his abdomen or chest. The warmth would radiate into his torso, helping maintain core temperature through the coldest hours. Another stone might be positioned near his feet. Feet, being at the extremity of the circulatory system and in contact with the cold ground, were particularly vulnerable to heat loss. A hot stone, even wrapped and not in direct contact with skin, could provide enough warmth to keep the feet from becoming dangerously cold. If the shepherd had prepared multiple stones, he might position them around his body, one at his feet, one at his core, perhaps one behind his back if he was sitting or lying against his windbreak. These stones created multiple points of warmth, reducing the overall heat loss from his body. The stones would remain warm for a surprisingly long time. A well-heated stone properly wrapped could provide perceptible warmth for 4 to 6 hours. The heat release was gradual, never intense, but steady and reliable. This matched well with the shepherd's needs. Gentle, sustained warmth through the pre-dawn hours when the cold was deepest and his body's reserves were most depleted. As the stones cooled, they did not suddenly become useless. Even a stone that had cooled to the point where it no longer felt warm was still warmer than the ambient air or ground. It continued to provide a slight thermal benefit, acting as insulation rather than an active heat source. The technique of using heated stones was particularly valuable because it decoupled warmth from fire. The fire could be allowed to die down or even go out completely, conserving fuel and reducing visibility, while the stones continued to provide heat. This meant the shepherd could rest more deeply during the middle hours of the night, not needing to wake repeatedly to tend the fire, yet still maintaining some protection against the cold. The stones could be reheated if the fire was rebuilt in the early morning. As dawn approached and the shepherd prepared to release the flock, he might add fresh fuel to the remaining coals, revive the fire briefly and reheat the stones. This would provide warmth during the transition from night to day, a period when movement was required, but the temperature was still very low. The thermal mass principle extended beyond portable stones. If the shepherd was using a stone wall as a windbreak, the surface of the wall facing the fire would also absorb heat. This heat would be retained and radiated back toward the shepherd's position, creating a more effective warming environment than the fire alone could provide. Some shepherds, in permanent shielding structures, would build fires against stone interior walls specifically to heat the wall mass. The stone wall would act as a radiator, absorbing heat during the evening and releasing it through the night. This passive heating was highly efficient, requiring less fuel and less attention than maintaining an active fire. The shepherd's use of stone as a heat bank demonstrated sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics. He was not simply trying to stay warm through constant heat generation. He was strategically storing heat during the period when fuel was being burned, then releasing that stored heat slowly during the period when fuel could not be spared for continuous burning. This approach maximized the utility of limited fuel resources. Every piece of wood or dung burned served dual purpose: immediate warmth from the flame and stored warmth in the heated stones. The stones became a thermal battery, charged by the fire and discharged slowly through the night. The technique was quiet, required no complex tools, and used materials available in almost any pastoral landscape. It was elegant in its simplicity and highly effective in its application. The shepherd, wrapped in his cloak, positioned across the fold's entrance, with heated stones providing gentle warmth at strategic points, had created a survival system that could sustain him through the long winter night.